Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. OPEC signals a surprise increase in crude oil output amid forecasts for a surge in global demand in the second half of the year.
Our other headlines, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken walks a diplomatic tightrope in the Middle East as officials meet in Jordan to discuss the humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
After the war, Ukraine's president appeals to political leaders at a Berlin forum to drum up billions of dollars for post-conflict reconstruction.
And UK unemployment unexpectedly rises to its highest level for 2.5 years. In a rather surprise move, the oil cartel OPEC has announced that it'll increase production in the fourth quarter. The group says global demand will rise over the coming months, fueled by a continued rebound in travel and tourism.
It comes after global oil consumption fell below expectations in the first quarter. The monthly report from the Organisation of the Petroleum Exporting Countries forecasts that demand will rise by around 2.3 million barrels a day towards the end of the year.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Johannes Pleshberger in Vienna. Johannes, what was behind those rather sluggish consumption figures in the first half of this year?
Well, yes, OPEC today had to admit that the oil demand growth was slower than previously expected this first quarter of the year. And of course, this is because of the multiple crises happening around the world and the slow economic growth worldwide. But OPEC also precised today that in China, which is the world's biggest crude buyer, oil demand decreased by 6% in April. So we're having those numbers now in this OPEC monthly report. But according to other experts, the slow demand growth we're seeing right now is actually similar to before the pandemic. So during the pandemic, we've seen this fall in oil demand, and then after the pandemic, the rebound. And right now, this is, according to some experts, actually a normalization of growth, so to say, back to normal.
Well, those same oil experts are presumably more split than usual on where demand goes from here. Why is that?
Yes, well, while OPEC predicts that there will be a relatively strong oil demand growth in the second half of this year, it also says that China actually will be the primary demand driver among non-OECD countries because of the travel rebound and, according to OPEC, an improving manufacturing sector. But this is contrary to what the International Energy Agency is saying. The IEA is expected to issue its forecast update tomorrow, but what we know so far is that they are saying that they are expecting a much lower oil demand growth this year and in the second half of this year. Now, why are these two bodies differing in their opinion? Well, OPEC sort of needs to justify its latest output increase announcement, according to which by October OPEC is going to increase oil production. But even if OPEC is wrong and demand will be lower than the output, then OPEC is famous for changing its mind regularly, and it can always go back to curbing production, and OPEC will always try to have prices stable and high.
Johannes, thank you for that. Our correspondent, Johannes Pleshberger in Vienna.
Well, let's talk now to Ellen Wald, who's an energy analyst and president at Transversal Consulting. Good to see you, Ellen. Welcome back to the programme. So as we've been hearing, a surprise move from OPEC. So why did they make this decision now?
Well, it seems like they are very much interested in telegraphing their plans in the long term. For such a long time, OPEC had been meeting every month. They'd been basically making decisions on a month-to-month basis, and now they're saying, look, we want to go back to these longer-term forecasts and decisions. And I think that that's actually very helpful for the market, but there is a period of adjustment while people reacclimate to these kind of longer framing that OPEC is offering.
And we saw a bit of an upheaval in the energy markets after this announcement, didn't we? What happened?
Well, it seems that the market was not, they were expecting a continuation of the current cuts and the current quotas, which really is what OPEC did deliver. But then on top of that, they extended their forecast and their decision kind of outward to say, look, we think we're going to start unrolling or we plan, or if everything goes according to how we think it's going to go, we're going to plan to start unrolling these cuts. And here's the process by which we're going to do it, which is a very gradual process. I think the market kind of was taken aback at that. And there's this idea that if more oil comes on the market, then prices are going to plummet. And so that's why we saw a lot of hedging. I think that was a bit premature, and people were acting based on maybe incomplete information.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because you would think, wouldn't you, that more production would mean that prices could potentially plummet due to greater supply. So what is their reasoning behind this move?
Well, OPEC does a lot. They have a whole team of analysts, economists, and everyone who are creating their own forecasts. And OPEC forecasts an increase in demand, to come in 2025 and maybe even late 2024. And given what we're seeing with travel and demand for jet fuel over the summer, it does seem like we are potentially in for an increase in demand. Of course, there are some signs that maybe we're not. Some gasoline inventories have been building, but there are always these kinds of signs, and we can't assume that OPEC knows exactly what they're doing, but their forecasts indicate an increase in demand and in consumption, and so they are preparing for that by preparing to increase supply in a very gradual way.
So in the run-up to the election in the United States, there's talk of a crackdown on the oil industry, investigating possible price fixing. What's the US's role in this move by OPEC?
So, what we're seeing from the U.S. is the FTC is looking at some concerns that potentially some CEOs of oil companies were talking to OPEC about production matters. The truth is that I think this is all entirely baseless. No single oil company in the U.S. has the ability to price fix, oil. Oil is the price of oil is determined on a global scale with massive amounts of trading taking place all over the world. Even OPEC doesn't have the ability to set oil prices. They can only try to impact the price based on how much they produce. So it seems to me that this is really a way to take a political stance on something that is never going to pan out in a real investigation.
So something of a split on the level of demand we can expect. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the IEA is wrong. I think that they're making their forecast based on an entirely unrealistic expectation of EV purchases and EVs growing on the road, and an unrealistic expectations of growth in renewables that we are not going to see pan out. And so I do think that OPEC is probably the more correct forecast than the IEA is, though, as we all know, no one can predict the future, but I do think that the IEA's forecast is not based on realistic expectations.
Ellen, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us today. That's Ellen Wald from Transversal Consulting.
US President Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, has been found guilty of lying about his drug use to illegally buy a gun. Let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett in New York. John, so Hunter Biden guilty on all three counts?
Yes, this news breaking only in the last half an hour or so. Hunter Biden is the brother of Beau Biden, and they are the sons of President Joe Biden from his first marriage. Now, Hunter Biden has just been found guilty, as you say, on all three counts against him. They're federal counts, basically the illegal possession of a firearm. And the story goes like this. Between 2015 and 2019, Hunter Biden was a very, very serious drug addict. Addicted, in fact, to one of the worst drugs that you can be addicted to, crack cocaine. The problem is for him, he in 2018, towards the end of his addiction, decided to buy a gun. And I think, don't quote me on this, I think he bought it in upstate New York, actually. And when he bought it, he only held the gun for 11 days, by the way, but when he bought it, they gave him a form and he had to fill the form in. And there was a question on there that said, are you addicted to drugs or are you in any way using drugs? And he ticked the no box. That's the problem from Hunter Biden's perspective. That's the crime right there. That is the federal crime. He lied because the feds say he was addicted to drugs at the time. So it's a box-ticking exercise, and he's been caught out by it. Now, his defense said, look, this is not fair. He was already in rehabilitation. The reason he ticked the box is because he didn't believe at the time he was a drug addict, because although he had been, he didn't think he was anymore because he'd been through the rehabilitation process. So that's why he ticks the box. The jury did not believe the defense. They chose to believe the prosecution. And the prosecution argument was that we don't actually have any emails or texts linking Hunter Biden to illicit drugs on the day of the purchase of the gun or the day before or the day after. But they did have evidence from what you would call the time frame of the crime. So they had evidence before he bought the gun and about 2 weeks after he bought the gun. And one of them was what I suspect tipped the jury in favor of a prosecution, because it was a friend texting Hunter Biden, and just 2 weeks after purchasing the gun, the friend said, "Where are you and how are you?" And he answered, "I'm lying on top of a car, half asleep, smoking crack cocaine." And so there, now we have the son of the president convicted of 3 felonies. What happens next is the judge will have to decide what the sentencing will be. There's no date, as far as I know. There wasn't a few moments ago when I came on the floor. No date for sentencing, but there will be a sentencing, obviously. And the judges tend to be quite kind in these cases, particularly if the defendant has been well behaved, as it were, and I believe Hunter Biden has been off drugs for a while. So he might get jail time. There's a potential for a lot of jail time. He might get probation. He might get a fine. We'll just have to wait and see. And of course, although the 2 cases are different, they are very political here. Reminds us that former President Trump, his sentencing for being found guilty on 34 cases in the hush money trial in New York 2 weeks ago, his sentencing is July the 11th, and the same process will apply. The judge there will decide either to give him jail time, which will bring a lot of issues for everybody if he does that, or probation, or community service, or a fine. Guys?
John, the Biden story is obviously going to dominate the news headlines there, but just back to the day's top business stories. Apple saying it's integrating its artificial intelligence across its applications. Why are Apple shares so volatile?
Yeah. I know. We couldn't believe it yesterday because they came out with what appeared to be pretty good news, and yet its shares tumbled quite significantly on Wall Street. The thing is, everybody knows that Apple is behind when it comes to AI, because I've told you on this program a million times, the leaders are NVIDIA and OpenAI and Microsoft, but not Apple. So something going on this week called the WWDC, which is the Worldwide Developers Conference, and most people like me don't pay much attention to it, quite frankly, because it's very complicated. However, geeks and Apple fans, they love it. And this Worldwide Developers Conference has more interest, really, than any other. No new products were announced. There was no Steve Jobs moment, you know, when he put his fingers into the small pocket on his jeans and pulled out the iPod. Remember that? Nothing like that. But Tim Cook did announce a deal with OpenAI, led by Sam Altman, and their ChatGPT, which we're all familiar with. Now, the idea is that they will apply ChatGPT to Siri. So Siri on the iPhone will become super smooth now and be able to anticipate things. And the example given was, if you put a business meeting on your calendar for next Wednesday, Siri will be able to anticipate whether there's a clash with something else that she knows you're doing, and she'll try to rearrange the date for you. And if all is well, she'll offer you, directions to get to the meeting and all that kind of stuff. In other words, it's just allowing OpenAI, ChatGPT, Siri to be super smooth, and you'll be able to ask her to do things and she'll be very, very accurate in her response. Now, Apple calls this Apple Intelligence. People on Wall Street are unhappy because they'd rather Apple develop this on their own rather than piggybacking with ChatGPT and OpenAI. And Elon Musk is unhappiest of all because he started OpenAI, then fell out with them. He's saying if this goes ahead, he'll ban all Apple products from Tesla, SpaceX, and X. He said it's an unacceptable security violation, and it might be. That's the fly in the ointment, and that's why the stock is down. Because it might be, because Apple is very, very good when it comes to security. People like that. But here, they've got an outside company, and all your data is going to be going over to OpenAI and ChatGPT now. And that is why the stock fell almost 2% yesterday. But ironically, it's now at all-time highs. So Wall Street didn't like the news yesterday, but they like it now.
John, the terrifying producer of this program, says you've got 5 seconds left. I just want to ask you about the Fed meeting now. Any major change expected? Yes or no answer?
Don strikes again. The famous Don Spain. No change. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye. That's our correspondent John Terrett in New York.
You're watching CGTN. Still to come. The head of the United Nations urges Israel and Hamas to agree on the latest ceasefire proposal.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The great transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
Well, China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us. And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. The head of the United Nations has urged Israel and Hamas to reach an agreement on the latest ceasefire proposal outlined by the United States and approved last night by the UN Security Council. Antonio Guterres described conditions in Gaza as deplorable, saying the scale of the carnage is the worst he's seen since his tenure began.
The United Nations Secretary-General is attending a Gaza aid conference in Jordan with other officials, including the US Secretary of State. Antony Blinken has been visiting the Middle East again in his latest mission to secure a peace deal.
Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Jonathan Regev, in Tel Aviv. So, Jonathan, has Blinken managed to persuade Israel to back this ceasefire plan?
It seems to be the case, at least officially, at least on the ground. The statements coming out of Israeli officials say that Israel backs this proposal, this UN decision. Why so? Israeli officials say that it will allow Israel to achieve its goals, which are first and foremost to bring the hostages back, and second, to make sure that Hamas is no longer a threat from Gaza. This is at least what is happening on the ground. How will the Israeli cabinet, the Israeli government, approve such a deal when we know that some members of the coalition, the far-right parties headed by ministers Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, we know that they oppose any deal. They also would oppose this kind of deal. So how will the coalition approve such an agreement? It is not exactly clear, but at least above the ground, Israeli officials say that Israel will back such a proposal. The fact that all this happened as a U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was in the area, probably yes. Probably his presence here, not by chance, in Israel, as this was decided in the Security Council, probably not by chance.
So we had this United Nations resolution being approved last night. Will that have any immediate effect on Israel's military operation?
On the long term, perhaps. On the short term, the answer is absolutely not. The war is continuing, raging at full scale. Still today, still plenty of operations over in Gaza, and also sirens sounding in some of the Gaza border communities. Therefore, on the moment, on the ground, the answer is no. It might have some long-term effects if Israel will eventually see an agreement that can bring in a relatively short amount of time all of the hostages back. Then yes, the pressure from the international community and from very large parts in the Israeli society will perhaps have an effect on the ground, on the warfare conducted. But at least for now, the war is ongoing in full scale, and unless there's some kind of pressure, mostly from the United States, then Israel sees no point in making any changes to its war plan. On the short term, once again, I say no changes on the ground, at least for now.
Jonathan, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Jonathan Regev in Tel Aviv.
Well, a senior Hamas official says the group has agreed to the ceasefire resolution adopted by the United Nations Security Council. Our correspondent Akram Al-Satari is in Gaza.
Well, personally, I see this as another front where two parties are warring in. Hamas understands that Israel is using all its diplomatic means for the sake of just consolidating its position on the ground, using its fire also to consolidate the advancement that has been achieved in the last few days, and using all of its allies for the sake of just building a consensus on the ceasefire that serves the best interests of Israel. This is the analogy that has been provided by some Palestinian analysts who were observing the situation and coming to conclusions about that kind of action and diplomatic communications that were taking place. Hamas said they welcome and approve that draft resolution, and they are ready to negotiate that indirectly. When they say that they are ready to negotiate that indirectly, they are saying they are ready for this resolution to be negotiated by Qatar and Egypt with the United States of America and with Israel. And at the very same time statement, they said that this ceasefire draft resolution guarantees the full withdrawal of the Israeli army from the different parts of the Gaza Strip, the full stoppage of the war or the sustainable ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, the full swap deal between Hamas and Israel, the full rebuilding process, and the unhindered access of the humanitarian aid. So by doing that, Hamas is trying to fight with the words and inculcate the fact that they accept that ceasefire proposal if it takes into consideration the 5 main demands that were made by Hamas. So another fight is taking place at the diplomatic front, and Hamas is trying to gain ground when it comes to that, and Israel is also trying to use the diplomatic ties of the United States to consolidate a diplomatic position that would lead eventually to achieving the goals of the war that was waged by Israel in Gaza 8 months ago.
Akram, can we turn to Israel's operation to rescue hostages at the weekend? Because the United Nations Human Rights Office has been talking about this. What more do we know?
Well, the Human Rights Office in the UN was blaming the two parties, Israel and Hamas, for the repercussions of that operation. Israel did not take into consideration the 3 main principles. Actually, they were compromised: the necessity, the proportionality, and the foreseeable, reasonable foreseeability of the incidents. The way Israeli troops acted on the ground led to the killing of more than 274 Palestinians, injuring more than 680 Palestinians, destroying more than 89 houses, and according to the UN Office of Human Rights, that was uncalled for, and Israel could have done that operation in a much lighter manner without causing that massive damage. Also, in the very same time, the UN Office for the Human Rights was blaming Hamas for hiding those hostages or captives within heavily populated areas such as Al-Nusayrat refugee camp, which led eventually to that adverse incidents that led to the killing of the people. So the UN Office for the Human Rights is blaming the two parties for that escalation and for the loss that has been taking place because of that incident.
It's been confirmed that Malawi's Vice President Saulos Chilima has been killed in a plane crash along with 9 others. They were travelling in a military aircraft which left the capital on Monday. Poor visibility meant the plane was not able to land at its destination and had to turn back. It then disappeared from radars, and aviation authorities lost contact. The wreckage was found in mountainous forestry. President Lazarus Chakwera called it a terrible tragedy.
Chinese police say a man has been arrested after 4 US lecturers were stabbed in Jilin City. The group was attacked while walking in a park. One person who tried to help was also injured. China's foreign ministry says the attack was a random, isolated incident, and none of the victims are in a life-threatening condition.
Singapore Airlines has offered compensation to passengers injured during a flight that suffered extreme turbulence last month. The airline said that those with minor injuries would receive $10,000, with bigger payouts for more serious injuries. Dozens of people were hurt and one person died when the plane dropped more than 50 metres in 4 seconds.
The political fallout continues following the European elections, which saw gains for far-right parties in a number of countries. In Germany, there were significant losses for Chancellor Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats and their coalition partner, the Greens. Our correspondent Natalie Carney reports.
Germany has the highest number of seats in the European Parliament with 96. The country's far-right Alternative for Deutschland, or AfD, now occupies 15 of them, having brought in just shy of 16% of the German votes. However, just days before the election, the party was kicked out of a far-right coalition of parties in the European Parliament because of statements made by its members that were considered outside acceptable political discourse. The party has been plagued with accusations of fascism and blatant racism, along with corruption and even spying for foreign countries. Yet, that does not appear to have hurt them much. Frustrated with the German government and EU politics, 60-year-old Monika Trodler in the western German state of Rhineland-Pfalz gave her vote to the AfD.
Was wir jetzt hier haben, ist keine Demokratie.
What we have now isn't a democracy. Countries no longer have anything to decide for themselves. Everything is decided from above in Brussels. I want to be able to have a say as a citizen. I want to be asked about important decisions.
Ich möchte gefragt werden bei wichtigen Entscheidungen.
She believes in the AfD, which prioritizes ethnic Germans and claims it can win her country's self-determination back. Distance from Brussels and an anti-migration stance have proven to be the strongest rallying points for most of the far-right groups across Europe. The AfD criticized former German Chancellor Angela Merkel's decision to open the borders to more than 1 million refugees and economic migrants in 2016. But that backlash is seen as helping the party enter the federal government for the first time a year later.
The COVID-19 pandemic also provided far-right parties with the opportunity to capitalize on the people's dismay of how the government was handling the crisis. Unilaterally implemented lockdown measures and mandatory vaccinations made many question the country's democracy, while the ruling coalition government's energy and climate policies have also been sharply criticized by the right.
The AfD goes further, claiming the policies of Germany's three-party ruling coalition are not only failing, but a threat to the country's peace and prosperity.
Politicians should be problem solver. But here we are now represented by troublemakers. That means they create the problem and they enforce the problem. And therefore I'm fighting for our kids, for our people here. Even they don't like me, I'm fighting for them.
Yet political theorists say that's exactly what the far-right want people to believe.
They see themselves in a greater conspiracy, and Germany is one orchestra of that. You have to differentiate the complexity of the social world between enemy and foe to get homogeneity, to get straight categories, to get order. And this is something they need in their mindset, and which is very attractive to a lot of people who are afraid of freedom and pluralism and something like that.
Still, the AfD remains the largest opposition party in Germany and continues to win powerful positions at both the state and EU level.
We will not continue as we did in the mass migration and not in the Green Deal.
However, exactly how much weight the AfD and other Eurosceptic nationalist parties will wield in Brussels will depend on their ability to work together. Natalie Carney, CGTN, Munich, Germany.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Ukraine's president appeals to political and business leaders at a Berlin forum to drum up billions of dollars for post-conflict reconstruction.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen axe.
The difference is in the detail, the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story, wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
We are all connected. Across borders, across continents, connected by ideas, a shared humanity. Stay connected.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. OPEC signals a surprise increase in crude oil output amid forecasts for a surge in global demand in the second half of this year.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken walks a diplomatic tightrope in the Middle East as officials meet in Jordan to discuss Gaza's humanitarian crisis.
Ukraine is looking to secure billions of dollars in post-war reconstruction funding. During a conference in Berlin, President Volodymyr Zelensky has told international political and business leaders that Russia's military campaign has depleted his country's infrastructure.
Kyiv's also hoping that the conference will cement its credentials as a future member of the European Union. Let's talk to our correspondent Peter Oliver in Berlin. So, Peter, what have the leaders been saying?
Right, well, President Zelensky was addressing a meeting of the Bundestag, the German parliament, just behind me. It was a packed house, apart from notable exceptions of the far-right Alternative for Germany party and the far-left BSW party. They didn't take their seats, as it seems Zelensky address them directly, as they're some of the politicians in this country that want to see the aid to Ukraine either halt or stopped altogether, and to try and freeze that conflict. He called on Germany's own history and this city's own history, saying that to do that would be to build a wall through his country, to divide his country, of course drawing on the imagery of the Berlin Wall, which separated the German capital between 1961 and 1989. He did say, though, earlier in the day at the reconstruction conference that the future for Ukraine was inside the European Union, that Ukraine had ticked all of the boxes it needed to tick and taken the steps it needed to take in order to start the accession talks.
Today we talked about Ukraine's European integration, about our expectations. Ukraine has done everything it needs to do to start negotiations on our country's membership in the European Union. Very soon we should receive approval of the negotiation framework.
Well, Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, also backed up what President Zelensky had to say, saying that she hoped those accession talks could really get underway as soon as by the end of this month. We also heard from German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who was on stage alongside President Zelensky, saying that the recent EU parliamentary elections that provided a bit of a kicking for his party, in fact quite a kicking, the worst result for them in over 100 years, but overall it showed that Europeans still supported political parties that wanted to give support both militarily, both in terms of moral support and in terms of financial support to Ukraine.
So could this conference change the course of the conflict with Russia?
Well, in terms of what's going on the ground in Ukraine, no, is the very short answer to that. What this conference has been looking at is what comes after the fighting has stopped. We heard from Christian Lindner, the finance minister here in Germany, as he signed what was called a reconstruction declaration alongside his Ukrainian counterpart, essentially saying that what this declaration cemented was Germany's support, not just for Ukraine during the fighting that's ongoing, but in the future of getting the money in to rebuild once the guns fall silent. Now, we heard a similar message from Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, as she said that there would be an extra $1.5 billion heading to Kyiv's coffers from the EU, and that a further sum of just under $2 billion would be heading there very, very soon. She also said that the EU would make available to Ukraine the interest that had been earned on frozen Russian assets, that cash would also be sent towards Kyiv. This conference very much looking at convincing the world of finance, the world of business, that they should look towards Ukraine for the future, that once the fighting stops, that they can invest heavily in Ukraine, particularly a lot of the message was when it comes to energy infrastructure, building of new power plants, and also making sure that the energy from those power plants can get to towns, cities and villages around Ukraine. We also heard from von der Leyen and others saying that investment from companies and construction businesses as well need to look to their future in Ukraine once the fighting is ended. But this wasn't a conference about ending that fighting, certainly not in the short term.
Peter, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Peter Oliver in Berlin.
Some undocumented migrants could soon be put on a fast track to United States citizenship. President Biden's administration is reportedly considering a plan that would allow them to remain and be given work permits as long as they're married to American citizens. Our correspondent Tony Waterman reports.
For hundreds of thousands of undocumented migrants, it's a game of legal limbo. They're in the U.S. illegally, but they're married to U.S. citizens. According to multiple reports, the White House is now considering giving those undocumented spouses long-term legal status, shielding them from deportation and allowing them to work legally in the country.
I don't want to get in front of the White House on this, but what I will say is that it is important that the president show leadership on this, which is what President Biden is doing. You know, you see Donald Trump on the campaign trail talking about the border, talking about the crisis at the border, blaming Democrats, when really Democrats are the ones who want to get something done.
Upwards of 800,000 people, mostly Latinos, would be directly impacted by long-term spousal protections, potentially winning Biden votes this November in crucial battleground states like Arizona and Nevada. It's a voting bloc his Republican rival, Donald Trump, is also targeting. Ahead of a campaign rally in Las Vegas on Sunday, the former president launched Latino Americans for Trump, a coalition supportive of stricter border policies.
Voting is so important for the Latino community so we can raise up our voice and everyone coordinate that We have a big problem with the border right now.
During the rally, Trump blasted Biden's recent executive order allowing the border to be shut down after a certain number of migrants are apprehended. An asylum ban similar to the one Trump tried to implement when he was in office.
What he signed means nothing. In fact, it makes it easier. In my opinion, it opens the border still further. November 5th will be the most important day in the history of our country.
Poll after poll has shown that immigration is the top issue for voters this November, with the vast majority believing Trump is better suited to handle the crisis than Biden. That political vulnerability has pushed Biden into uncharted territory. Last week, he unveiled the most restrictive immigration policy of his political career, allowing officials to seal the border and turn asylum seekers away when crossings surge. Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas defended the policy on Sunday, saying the White House stands by its legality and is ready to fight any court challenges.
It's early. The signs are positive. Our personnel have done an extraordinary job in implementing a very big shift in how we operate on the southern border.
For both Trump and Biden this November, immigration policy could be the biggest obstacle or the clearest path to reaching the White House. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Austin, Texas.
Mexico City is running out of water after weeks of drought. Supplies have been rationed, with experts warning that the situation is now becoming critical. Our correspondent Alistair Baverstock reports.
Mexico City, home to 21 million people, is living through a water crisis. Rationing is already a reality in parts of the capital, where residents like Pablo Irurita have had no choice but to adapt.
Since the start of the year, we have faced water problems. There have been many unexpected cuts, and our supply has been rationed. Yet my water bill has remained the same, whether or not water is available.
Mexico City's geography makes it vulnerable in times of climate change.
Mexico City is at an altitude of 2,240 meters. Just to pump the water here implies an enormous amount of energy.
Impresionante. 120 kilometers away, the capital's standing water resources are heavily depleted. The Cutzamala system of 7 interconnected reservoirs is at historically low levels due to higher temperatures, a rainy season that won't start, and aging infrastructure which leaks as much as 40% of its water supply to the capital. It's a problem impacting not just Mexico City, but the entire region.
We have water shortages in all the communities around this reservoir. The rains are arriving later and later every year, and it's affecting us significantly.
Further downstream in Valle de Bravo, the last reservoir in the system to be fed by natural streams sits at 28% capacity.
This is Mexico City's water tank, and its levels have reached red alert.
But as the alarm sounds from afar, Mexico City will need to hear it.
Mexico has a lot of water, enough for everyone. What we don't have is a culture of preserving water.
Water has essential uses, and uses which are completely irrelevant. We need to start taking greater care of our water, because as a resource, I believe it will be as important as oil in the 21st century.
Alistair Baverstock, CGTN, Mexico City.
China's vehicle sales fell slightly last month, but performed better than expected as consumer sentiment improved after government subsidies. Over 1.7 million passenger cars were sold in May, a small decrease from the previous year, but up 11% from April. Of the cars sold, nearly half were electric and plug-in hybrids. Chinese EV maker BYD maintained its leading position, followed by Tesla.
Moody's has warned that France's snap parliamentary election will damage the country's credit reputation. The ratings agency pointed to the country's high debt burden, saying any political instability was a credit risk. President Macron called the surprise vote on Monday after suffering severe losses in European elections at the weekend.
Shares in the budget computing firm Raspberry Pi have soared more than 30% on their first day of trading in the UK. It's seen as a boost for the London market, which has been struggling to attract listings from tech companies. Raspberry Pi launched 12 years ago, selling computer boards for hobbyists. Last year, it made a profit of nearly $40 million.
Unemployment in the United Kingdom is at its highest level in nearly 3 years. In the 3 months to April, the jobless rate rose to 4.4%. That's the highest since September 2021 during the pandemic. Wages, however, continue to rise faster than inflation. These figures are something of a blow to the government, coming less than a month before the UK general election. Well, let's talk to Fiona Cincotta, who's an analyst at City Index. Fiona, welcome back. Good to see you. Why the rise in the UK's unemployment rate to 4.4%, and just how significant is this?
OK, so the rise in unemployment comes as we've seen company payrolls fall by 3,000 across the month. We've also seen job vacancies fall for a 23rd straight month. So these are signs that the UK jobs market is weakening, and that's really coming as we've had this high interest rate of 16-year high, which is basically putting the brakes on the UK economy, and that's being reflected in this weakening in the jobs market. I mean, it's very significant in the sense that we do need to see a weakening in the jobs market in order for a slowing in the economy to occur and for the Bank of England to be able to start cutting interest rates.
I was never very good at economics, but despite the rise in unemployment, you'd have thought wage growth remaining strong. Wages, though, are continuing to rise faster than prices. How come?
Yes, I mean, it would be too simple if it all went in the straight line, wouldn't it? You know, but what we're seeing here, is sort of wage growth is still strong. I think what's interesting is it could have been stronger, because let's not forget that in April, we saw an almost 10% increase in the minimum wage. So that would have been feeding through into these numbers. But I think what it does tell us is that when people are changing jobs, they can still demand high wages. So there is still a tightness in the jobs market. But I think potentially it's also telling us that there could be a little bit of a mismatch with the skills that are available and the skills that those hiring are actually looking to hire.
You talk about a tightness in the jobs market, but one of the other things we really should talk about is the increase in unemployment and inactivity rates for the UK economy.
Yeah, so this seems to be a sort of a growing problem, is this increasing level of inactivity. And it's something that we know that the government has been looking to try and address. And also rising unemployment. I mean, it is a problem because obviously rising unemployment does also mean that those sort of households have less to spend. So it can have a broader impact on the economy. But as I said, I don't think these levels right now are at a level that the Bank of England's going to consider to start cutting interest rates. They're not going to see the jobs market as weak enough yet to start cutting in the June meeting.
Fiona, good to see you. Thanks for coming on the show. Fiona Cincotta from City Index.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. More on those plans by Apple to integrate artificial intelligence into its products and why Elon Musk is furious.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. China has called on the BRICS group of countries to play a bigger role on the international stage. Those comments were made by China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi on the final day of the meeting in Russia. Wang Yi said China would welcome more countries to join the BRICS group.
Let's get more now on those plans by Apple to integrate artificial intelligence into its products. Consumers will be able to create text and images on demand.
But the tech giant says it's looking to distinguish itself from the competition by emphasizing its privacy features. Our correspondent Mark New reports.
With companies like OpenAI, Google, and Microsoft leading the charge in generative AI, Apple kicked off its Worldwide Developers Conference by introducing its own branding, Apple Intelligence.
We want to ensure that the outcome reflects the principles at the core of our products.
Apple says its personal assistant Siri is now able to retrieve and analyze the most relevant data on the screen that you're working on or within all your apps. It showed examples of Siri finding an email where a friend recommended books, and how when filling out a form that requires personal information, it can pull up a photo of your driver's license and enter the details for you.
What Apple does is it zeroes in and says instead, I'm going to inference just your personal data, and then I'm going to integrate AI into that database. So I can make all of your apps or your content more applicable to an artificial intelligence engine, and therefore we could do all kind of new things that are much more personal.
Apple is using its own architecture, from chips to software to devices, enabling its AI to better understand you. The company says that means greater security, since the AI features are mostly happening on your device as opposed to in the cloud. But if a request requires computational power off-device, Apple Intelligence claims it will only send the data that's relevant to your task to be processed on highly secure Apple Silicon servers.
You should not have to hand over all the details of your life to be warehoused and analyzed in someone's AI cloud. With Apple Intelligence, powerful intelligence goes hand in hand with powerful privacy.
And that includes partnering with generative AI leader OpenAI in a unique way. Siri can tap into ChatGPT, but ask your permission first to share your request with that chatbot.
If you want some advice on decorating, you can take a picture and ask, what kind of plants would go well on this deck? Siri confirms if it's okay to share your photo with ChatGPT and brings back relevant suggestions.
Apple also unveiled some new AI features that allows you to sift through and enhance your own content. For example, you can actually remove unwanted distractions in a photo and search for very specific photos and within video too. It also showed an example where it could find a specific moment of a video where Maria was cartwheeling on the grass.
For all of this to work, you have to have a device that has at least an M1 processor on it. Because M1 and the M series processors have the advanced neural engine, I suspect that it will also cause a great refresh cycle for new phones, new Macs, and new iPads that have higher processors that run the neural engine.
So, as Apple seeks to harness the power of AI in personal ways, it also hopes consumers will be willing to shell out more to have that power in the palm of their hand. Mark New, CGTN, San Francisco.
In a world first, a Chinese medical team has operated remotely on a cancer patient from a different continent. The pioneering procedure involved a robot in Beijing being controlled by a specialist in Rome. Our correspondent Jen Copestake reports.
This patient in Beijing is being operated on by a robot controlled from the Italian capital Rome, over 8,000 kilometers away. The Chinese team, including a backup surgeon, watched the operation closely at the 3rd Medical Center of the People's Liberation Army General Hospital. Professor Zhang Xu guided the robotic arms remotely via surgical console to complete the delicate work of removing a lesion from the patient's prostate. The two-way communication may be happening between cities on opposite sides of the world, but the robot performed the surgery as if the doctor was in the room. The delay or latency was only 135 milliseconds, below the 200 millisecond standard suggested by various medical studies for telesurgery.
The biggest problem with remote surgery is communication and whether there is any delay. Today there was almost no delay, the same as an on-site surgery.
To me it was really an historical experience, an historical moment. The fact that he was able to do it in Rome, it makes us very, very happy.
After the success of the operation, the team says it will experiment with using the technology to direct surgical treatments for the military in frontline and remote environments. Jen Copestake, CGTN.
Finally, humans usually address each other with names, but what about animals? Found that African elephants also respond to individual names, something that only a few wild animals are known to do. They use low-frequency rumbles to call each other over long distances. Scientists say animals with complex social structures and family groups are more likely to use individual names.
The headlines again. OPEC signals a surprise increase in crude oil output amid forecasts for a surge in global demand in the second half of the year.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken walks a diplomatic tightrope in the Middle East as officials meet in Jordan to discuss the humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
And after the war, Ukraine's president appeals to political leaders at a Berlin forum to drum up billions of dollars for post-conflict reconstruction.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place, from all of the team in London. It's goodbye.
Goodbye.